junk science, right? It's faulty information or research used to advance special interests. Well, now we're seeing the rise of junk history. And it's not just skirmishes over BS founding father quotes or fights over how slavery is taught in public schools. Now it's reaching the Supreme Court. But normally the phrase history and tradition is about as grounding as it gets. We depend on them for context and perspective, and we expect more than spin when it comes to historical facts. That's especially true in a nation founded on an idea and not a tribal identity, because America depends on shared stories rooted in real history to create a sense of common purpose. Now, a lot of times, we see junk history thrown around by activists on the far left and far right who want to twist American history to their own ideological ends. But I expect Supreme Court justices and even U.S. senators to get their history right. Instead, we've seen some epic fails in recent days. Now, Justice Clarence Thomas put a great deal of weight on history and tradition in his decision, removing a century-old New York law that required a permit to carry a gun in public. Thomas asserted this was outside American norms. But it's not, especially in the context of the Old West. Because even in those frontier days, when America's gun culture mythology really begins, the reality is that you couldn't take your guns to town. That's right. In legendary locales from Tombstone to Dodge City, firearms had to be surrendered at the town limits, specifically to avoid gunfights, especially in and around saloons. Now take a look at this sign, 1873, outside Dodge City, Kansas, identified by UCLA law professor Adam Winkler in his book Gunfight. That sign says, "The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited." This was a common sense requirement imposed by local sheriffs that recognized, in conservative Judge Michael Luttig's words, the delicate balance between the Second Amendment's twin concerns for self-defense and public safety. Likewise, Justice Alito's decision overturning a half-century of precedent for Roe and Casey invoked the phrase history and tradition 21 times, going back to laws that notably predated the end of slavery. Now, in one instance, Justice Alito cites Abraham Lincoln on the word liberty, ostensibly to show that we all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. Now, the implication is that the meaning of words depends on the perspective of the speaker, and therefore, true definition is not knowable. But that's not what Lincoln meant, as the next line in that 1864 speech shows. Lincoln was focused on puncturing the hypocrisy of Confederacies invoking liberty as an excuse to maintain slavery, which, yes, was a thing they did. Lincoln often spoke in parables. And here's what he said: "The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep was a black one." The point is explicitly not that the meaning of liberty is unknowable, but that Lincoln believed that some uses are counterfeit. Words have meaning, which is why Lincoln concludes by saying that the Wolf's Dictionary has been repudiated by anti-slavery Union gains in the Civil War. But perhaps the worst recent misuse of history came from Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn, coming off one of his finest hours by shepherding through a modest but meaningful bipartisan gun bill. But he apparently felt he needed to play to the base, and so he crossed swords with former President Obama on Twitter. You see, Obama had criticized the repeal of Roe v. Wade by tweeting, "Today, the Supreme Court not only reversed nearly 50 years of precedent, it relegated the most intensely personal decision someone can make to the whims of politicians and ideologues, attacking the essential freedoms of millions of Americans." To which Cornyn replied, "Now do Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education." He's referring, of course, to the Supreme Court decision that justified segregation with the unanimous ruling that overturned it under the leadership of liberal Republican Chief Justice Earl Warren. And no, contrary to some overheated liberal critics on Twitter, Senator Cornyn was not somehow calling for a repeal of Brown v. Board. But let's level set here. While Brown v. Board reversed precedent, directionally, it's totally different. Plessy v. Ferguson enshrined discrimination under the logic of states' rights. The Dobbs decision reverts to states' rights to remove a constitutional protection. Now, to some extent, history is a debate that never ends. But to have that civic conversation across the generations be constructive, it really needs to be rooted in shared facts. And that's your reality check.